Tuesdays. On Fridays, there is no lunchtime talk, but we have the last lecture, the annual lecture series, that will be given by Holly Anderson, who is right there with us today. Welcome, Holly. It's very good to have you around. And she will be talking about the asymmetry of explanation and the pragmatist account of the asymmetry of explanation. The talk is at 3:30 on the 10th floor and will be followed by a reception around 5:50 or something like that. The next lunchtime talk will be on Tuesday at noon, Tuesday next week, and will be given by Megan Page, who has been fellow at the center for the whole year. And it will be on pluralism in climate modeling. We're also looking forward to that talk. And let me remind you of the Spacetime Functionalism Conference, not unrelated to the talk today, which will be taking place on April 1st and 2nd. The program is not online just yet, but we're going to put it very soon so you have a list of the speakers and when they are speaking. If you want to come to the conference, please, as I've said many times, sorry to repeat myself, but go to the website and register. So we have a head count before the conference. Today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Eleanor Knox, who is a professor at King's. She's been a senior visiting fellow at the center. We're very lucky to have Eleanor with us for many reasons, including her talent, also her breadth and her interest in many different topics. Eleanor works mostly in the foundations of space-time physics. She has a lot of interest on space-time, as it goes without won't come as a surprise, but also with a range of notions around issues of space-times in physics, such as emergence and related notion and questions, role of explanation in models, for example. She has published widely in the best journal. I will mention the recently edited companion, the Routledge companion to the philosophy of physics, which I'm not sure what the date was. It was saying 2021, 2023.
I think
it's a new
version.
version.
21. Oh, no, I think it's 21.
Isn't there a paperback version?
Is there? Great.
It is a ideal paperback version because it was 2023 dates.
It's just out in paperback. And it costs
I think that might actually be
go out buy it.
It might actually be the case as a paperback version because it was 23 days. Anyway, so it was published in 21, and she has published on a range of topics. She had a recent paper on PPR, on spatial temporal explanation. She had a paper on emergence in studies also a few years ago, and so on and so forth. Today, Eleanor will be talking about space-time functionalism and inertial frames. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. I should say very soon about what a great year it's been and how nice it's been to be here. Very lucky. I can't believe it's kind of coming to the end of the semester. So this talk, I had two thoughts about what I should talk about today, and one I thought, I'm sort of working on this sort of stuff on kind of thinking about some criticisms of my work, and that's, what I should be talking about right now. And anyway, maybe it'd be a good idea to give a kind of advert for the space-time functionalism course and conference, and then people kind of work out whether they want to attend it or not. And then I was giving a version of this talk on Friday in Irvine, and I realized two things. One was that it was really a talk supposed to be about like a kind of invite between me and several friends. And two, that any version I gave of it might well put off at least as many people from coming to the space-time functions conference as it would turn out to. Happily, I don't know how many people have currently registered for the space-time functions conference. I haven't checked. So, I won't be able to track whether the numbers go up or down after this talk. I should also say that it is more representative of a particular debate that I've been engaged in that represents some of the literature. But one of the things I tried to do for the conference is bring in a broader group of people talking about things in different ways. So this may not be. All right. So what am I trying to do today? I want to explain and give a kind of limited defense of a kind of space-time functionalism, which I call inertial frame functionalism. And that's going to go by kind of defending the fact that there's this notion called an inertial frame that's very useful for interpreting space-time theories. As I've already indicated, there's a kind of alternative description of this talk, which is that it's a changed version of an extraordinarily niche talk that I gave on Friday. And I'm going to try and give a slightly more of an overview of the debate and make some less niche points about philosophy of physics along the way. I pride myself on being kind of bilingual in English and American English, but I will never use the phrase niche. I realized that was like when I was thinking about this, I was like, that's one. I'm American, I'm a closet American, but yes, niche. I feel like some Americans use niche, right? And you should all. I don't know why I feel strongly about that. Okay. So what's space-time functionalism? Well, there's sort of slogans and it's kind of a vague notion, but the idea is, look, space-time is basically a functional concept. So a field or an object or some bit of structure you identify in your theory is going to be spatio-temporal by the virtue of playing a certain kind of role in your theory. Space-time by virtue of what it does, not what it is. And to an awful lot of people in philosophy of physics, that the ones that most of the ones that I talk to the most, there's a certain kind of obviousness to this, because I think a lot of people think we should be something like functionalists about an awful lot of concepts. It kind of stands in opposition to a very, very strongly metaphysical tradition in philosophy of space-time, where there's some kind of categorical definition of space-time as a kind of container, or the thing in which we live. And there's certainly people in the philosophy of physics literature that have that notion of space-time, but there's also a lot who don't. But then, of course, the devil's always in the details, working out exactly whether this kind of account works and how you make it work. Turns out to be where a lot of the action is. And even amongst those who sort of think that there is something in the region of space-time functionalism that's a helpful view, there is some kind of disagreement. So one question is what it's got to do with the project of quantum gravity. So in theories of quantum gravity, people often say that theories of quantum gravity are going to be non-spatio-temporal. They don't look like they have space-time at the ground level. And then there are an interesting class of questions about how space-time might emerge at a higher level. So to me, it was always sort of obvious that maybe functionalist thinking would be helpful simply because lots of the initial comments people make about emergent space-time theories is just, space-time isn't the kind of emerge. It's not like temperatures and people. I just think space-time's a lot more like a temperature than you might think it is, or like heat, perhaps. But other people think that it might help with quantum gravity in a more direct way. It might help you find space-time in quantum gravity itself. That's partly the debate about the kind of nature of the functionalism we're looking for. So what kind of functionalism is this? You could think it's a kind of reductive functionalism, or you could, as I do, think it's a kind of interpretive functionalism. Say a little bit more about that. When we get into the more niche debates, there's quite a lot of literature talking about the relationship between this and a debate that's been going on in philosophy of relativity for quite a long time that comes under the kind of dynamical versus geometrical banner. So Harvey Brown wrote this 2005 book that said we should think about relativity as sort of having kind of geometric or chronogeometric significance because of the details of the dynamics. And there's been a kind of long literature about that, and that's very much, I mean, I was supervised in part by Harvey Brown as an undergrad, very much I see my functionalism as coming out of that, and so there's a lot of debate about how notions in that literature and this relate. And the last of these, I mean, if you've ever done functionalism in philosophy of mind, it's almost a weird question to really be asking is what's the functional role? It sounds like it should be an obvious question to ask about a kind of functionalism, but it's the kind of question we studiously avoid as philosophers. And you might discover why, because I think the reason what I think the functional role is for space-time sort of came prior to my calling myself a space-time functionalist. And as a result, I'm kind of on the record articulating a particular functional role for space-time. And what that makes me is a massive target for criticism, which I don't mind at all, because it means people engage with me. But of course, if you stick your neck out and actually say what you think space-time does in a theory, you won't be, uncontroversially right, and you'll have far fewer people agree with you. So it's this last question that I want to focus on today, largely, although I'll say some other things about the first few questions along the way. So if you think the last question is really boring and the other questions are really interesting, you might want to come to the conference. And leave the talk now, but that's okay. Good. Right, so I advocate, when I say advocate, I'm going to do lots of hedging, because I just think this is useful. I just think this is a good starting point, a good way to interpret theories. But I advocate something that gets called inertial frame functionalism. I say, look, there's this sort of notion that floats around in our various contemporary space-time theories of inertial structure, and it's a pretty good shorthand for most of the things we want space-time to do. So picking out a functional role could be a list of every single thing we expect a particular piece of structure to do within a theory. There's this sort of shorthand which we already have on the table, which is kind of an obviously functional notion of inertial structure. And it's very tied up with our space-time concept. So I think that the functional role will be filled by some field or object if that structure defines a local structure of inertial frames. That's put as an if, but not an only if. Although I think it covers lots of interesting cases. And as I say, it's not meant to be obviously reducing it to something more functional, it's just giving a kind of a notion that's a simpler functional notion than the space-time one, perhaps. Before I get into the details, so a lot of this talk is going to be about whether that notion of inertial structure is sufficiently well defined to do any work, which is what's controversial in the kind of details of space-time literature. And I'll defend the idea that it is. But some comments on functionalism more broadly. So as I said, I see functionalism as an interpretative tool, not an inherently reductive tool. So David Wallace and I have recently written a paper talking about what you might call the distinction between constitutive functionalism and causal role functionalism. So I'm thinking of this functionalism not as something, a kind of Lewisian notion where you pick out a causal role and use it to find a realizer and thus reduce to a lower level theory. I'm thinking of it as something that tells you, without advert, without discussing the lower level theory, how to interpret a particular theory's level. I don't think that when you pick out a functional role, you're doing it once and for all. It's of course it's context and theory dependent, and concepts are tricksy and they shift around in a very context dependent way. And this is a hard circle to square, but of course it's also true. I try and take lessons from people who have thought deep and hard about concepts in physical theory. And I hope I've internalized some of them. Referencing Mark, in case that's not obvious. But certain concepts like particle and force and space-time, for example, have some pre-theoretic and cross-theoretic associations. So when we try and do this funny project of putting into language the things that we understand about theories, certain of these concepts turn out to be quite important and we end up having debates about them, and it's pretty important to be clear what we mean. And so you need some kind of relation between the functional role that some kind of term that you're using in one theory plays in one context and in other contexts, or you need to be very clear about how you think those things are shifting around, just so that you don't end up having unhelpful philosophical debates. So I think inertial frame is a bit like that. It's one of these notions that's going to move in theoretical contexts. It's not always going to, and that's part of the morals of today's talk. But on the other hand, I think there's enough commonality that it allows us to have conversations about what we're saying about different theories comparatively. And that's I think just generally in philosophy of science, it's a subtle matter about how we do manage to understand a new theory in which all of the theoretical terms have slightly changed their roles and meanings. So I see that this is, an attempt to make some comments in a project like that, not an attempt to legislate on the one true space-time concept, because there's no such thing. It should be a conceptual pluralist in general. And also sometimes functional roles can come apart. So you could think there are a couple of useful roles for space-time, and they might be together in some theories and come apart in others. I also, and this is sort of, this entire approach is meant to be able to be kind of flexible about interpretation of theories. So one of the things that I think you need to be able to say is that something like the metric of general relativity, things generally taken to define as geometry, it could play a functional role in some circumstances or at some scales and not in others. So you can have kind of breakdowns of functional roles, and you needn't have a kind of crisis of confidence that you've got a space-time theory. And you might have scale relativity of space-time structure as well. I'll say a bit more about that in a second. So in those kinds of cases, you might choose to still attach the label space-time to the metric, but the fact that you're a functionalist might make you feel a little bit laid back about what's going on. So you might say, if you think that sort of space-time is this kind of, inviolable container that constrains our laws, and you discover places where it's doing something really weird, you might feel kind of deep disquiet. And so some of this functionalist approach is just meant to put you at ease, that, as I say, treating space-time a little bit more like you might treat thermodynamic notions. And another comment is that there better be some connection, and this is where the connection with dynamic relativity comes in. There better be some connection between this role I'm describing for space-time and what you might think of as operationalized geometry, right? So you might think that the reason that the metric in general relativity, the reason we call it space-time, about sort of any kind of deeper metaphysical debate, is that it's got something to do with notions like length and angle and things that rods and clocks read. And so you need a notion that links things up with what Harvey Brown calls chronogeometric significance. Okay. So I think inertial frames do a lot of that work. That's why I kind of think they're an interesting notion, and it's why I think we should defend and rehabilitate them in contexts where people have questioned that they apply. Okay, so what's an inertial frame? Well, here are the kinds of things that you might say about an inertial frame in, say, Newtonian mechanics or in special relativity. It's going to have to be a bit more subtle in general relativity. So inertial frames are frames with respect to which force-free bodies move with constant velocities. The laws of physics take the same form, sometimes called a particularly simple form, with respect to the coordinates of an inertial frame. And all bodies and physical laws pick out the same class of inertial frames. Now, what does that boil down to operationally? It partly underpins our ability to do laboratory physics, right? It's really quite hard to do physics in a lab that's rapidly rotating. It's inconvenient. You've got these pesky illusory forces. But I mean, in fact, small we don't really do physics much in inertial frames according to general relativity, but we do understand at least how to think about gravity and whether it's going to affect our experiments. And we do understand that, you know, there are certain kinds of ascent. We're fine to do your physics on a smoothly moving train or in this room, but it's not a great idea to do your physics, in a rapidly rotating, kind of out of control rotating restaurant at the top of a skyscraper.
I mean, there are lots of reasons.
Yes, we were determined. But one of them is that it's going to be quite tricky to make generalizations based on the kinds of physics you discover in your arbitrarily rotating reference frames, for example. So inertial reference frames are these nice reference frames where the laws are well behaved and things tend to behave the same way. As I say, we'll need a little bit of modification of clause 2 for general relativity. And that's all pinned, these notions are really old, and that's sort of why they're useful. Concepts change, but it's also nice to have a kind of secure footing in the kinds of things that you might have learned in kind of, physics 101. So, of course, most people know that Newtonian mechanics obeys the Galilean principle of relativity, right? Famously summed up by Galileo's ship experiment, which was that if you were on a smoothly moving ship with constant velocity, there's no experiment you could do to say whether you were at rest, whether you were moving on the ship. So that's the Galilean principle of relativity, thus expressed in a kind of empirical symmetry that we observe in the world around us, that you've observed a million times when you're American, you might not have had the train experience, particularly visceral on the train. And the chance of being on 2 passenger trains that are actually moving past each other simultaneously in this country is very small. But if you've ever had that experience, there's definitely a kind of discombobulating, has my train started moving, or has the one next to me started moving experience, which you could repeat for planes, etc. Good. So, and I'm hoping this I've stuck in because I'm hoping this is very familiar ground. It grounds you all before I say things that aren't familiar. So, so this will be quick, but hopefully familiar. So, philosophy physics 101 there was a problem. Newton believed in absolute space, right? There was a single privileged reference frame for Newton. The reference frame in which the spatial points in which everything was at rest. Everything really at rest would be at rest in that reference frame. I don't talk about reference frames, but that's the thought behind Newtonian absolute space. But Newtonian mechanics obeys Galileo's principle of relativity. So this particular state of absolute rest, this preferred reference frame, is completely unobservable. And one way of expressing the solution that you can kind of crank out after, reading Leibniz and then skipping forward a couple of hundred years in conceptual developments, is to accept that there's a privileged class of reference frames relative to which accelerations, but not absolute velocity define the inertial reference frames. And then if we really go into kind of Whiggish history, what we typically say to our students is, look, you can identify that class of inertial reference frames, the ones that pick out the right frames in which to do Newtonian physics. You can pick those out, you can associate those with a space-time structure, neo-Newtonian or Galilean space-time. And that's a space-time with a sense of constant velocity motion, so a straight line structure. But no rest frame, no absolute way of sewing the spaces at times together to tell you whether you're at the same point at another time. But it has this inertial structure, so you can tell the difference between the curvy accelerated lines and the straight constant velocity lines. This is John at the beginning that said, I'm so glad there'll be pictures. And I think that he didn't realize that that's the best I could do. A bit embarrassing. So mostly I steal John's pictures, and that's how pictures come from my slides, and on this case. Okay, so that kind of, I think, pretty obvious, intuitive way of thinking about space-time. I want to kind of elevate a little bit, kind of a really useful way to get a conceptual handle on space-time. So that connection between inertial structure and space-time structure is important, because what you just did there was encode a whole symmetry of the dynamics in the notion of inertial frame. And so what you got, you sort of managed to embed this fact that the dynamics, the actual physics were such that they were going to obey Galileo's principle of relativity. And inertial structure is a kind of shorthand for those kinds of relationships. If you get that relationship wrong, things start to go wrong. So my kind of grad school work was largely about kind of weird examples of alternative physics theories where this goes wrong and physicists were saying silly things about what space-time structure, and those theories just didn't make sense because everything wasn't linked up in the right way. But I won't go into those, but here is a really simple example. It's from a philosophy compass article on substantivalism and relationism in physics. Okay, so Dasgupta wrote an article which is largely supposed to take you through the kind of reasoning, the Newtonian space-time reasoning I just talked through. And then he postulates a sort of a big worry, what he thinks of as a big worry for underdetermination of Newtonian space-time structure. So he says, look, let's take two theories. T1 is just ordinary Newtonian mechanics in Galilean space-time. And in that space-time, force-free bodies follow straight line trajectories through the space-time. That's what we just described. T2 is a theory that, honestly, don't actually know what this next phrase is going to mean, but it's going to hold the same bodies to be force-free, but insists that those are following curved trajectories through space-time, and that forces cause deviations from curved trajectories. Put it to you, what's just happened is he's taken a whole lot of concepts that we have neatly associated with one another and torn them apart and thrown all of our associations out the window. So here's how Tom Barrett described this argument. So he drew pictures, which is why I have to borrow Barrett's arguments. Because look how much better they are than mine. You can see what would have happened if I tried to make those nice curvy lines in paint. So literally what he's suggesting is that what you can do is you can take Newtonian mechanics and kind of sit everything except the curve, the space-time structure, keep it exactly the same. And then you can worry that, in fact, those straight lines are curved lines. So you just vary your geometry such they look curved. But you keep everything else the same. These are sort of force-free trajectories. And Dasgupta thinks that this is actually should give you, I mean, he has some solutions to the problem of underdetermination, but he thinks that you can get a problem of underdetermination of theory off the ground, right? So, thinks, look, T1 asserts the body is traversing a straight trajectory, T2 asserts the body is traversing curved trajectory, and P3 we have no reason to prefer T1 over T2 or vice versa.
Has he told us what he means by curved?
It means curved with respect to some geometry, I take it. I think that's the. So he's written down a new connection. So what he's done, what you're going to do to implement T2 is you're going to write down some mathematical structure that represents the geometry, relative to which our ordinary stuff all looks like it's wiggling around. Right? That's not how we theorize. And the way I'd like to put what's gone wrong here. So John Barrett has like a nice argument about why this doesn't work. Thank him for. I don't think I would have necessarily read this philosophy compass article or noticed it. I mean, this looks like, by the way, a stereotype of an argument, but I would like to say that in a much, much more mathematized form, I think that there are physics theories that have done exactly this. So, I mean, I think and this is not to kind of bash Schmidt, but actually I find this kind of, it's useful that somebody wrote down in philosophy art literature an incredibly simple version of an argument, of a trap that I think physicists fall into and they're not thinking clearly. So look, I mean, you can argue, like, it's just kind of obvious that either you have to think of these two things as equivalent, or T2 is a terrible theory, and there's plenty of good reasons to choose between them where you think they're equivalent. But I think you can think quite informally about what's gone wrong with Dasgupta's thinking here. What you've done is you've postulated a theory that uses these words like force-free and curved space-time trajectory. And of course I can mathematically write down a geometry that makes that true. but that geometry is doing nothing. There's no earthly reason you would ever write down a space-time such that the space-time, the actual geometries had absolutely nothing to do with the trajectory of a force-free body. It's a free country, you can write down all the mathematical structure you like. But but what you've done is just tear apart all of the associations we have between geometrical structure of a theory, the notion of a straight line, the trajectory of a force-free body. The problem is that you've postulated some mathematical geometry that just doesn't play the right role with respect to the theory. So this is might mean to convince you that you have some space-time functionalist instincts. I mean, it's sort of clear that something's gone wrong, right? You've postulated some structure that's not doing the right thing. And there's going to be a class of people with whom I disagree that think I can conceive of doing that, but it's just bad theorizing. I would put it to you that you can conceive of writing down the mathematics, but you're not conceiving the space-time structure in that particular case. You don't have to be a space-time functionalist to see what's gone wrong here, but it helps. So, you know, so we all have some of these instincts, I hope, apart from apparently Schmidt, but you know. I have a feeling I'm going to go into in a minute. I'm going to go into what I think. I'm going to go into what I think maybe what he tried to get and simplify in this, but well, maybe not. It's a bit exegesis of a compass article. It's not tricky. All right, but what's the moral here? Well, when you interpret theories in general, you should look at the role that some piece of mathematical structure plays before working out what it represents physically. Functional criteria determine interpretation. I really don't think that should be overwhelmingly controversial, but it is to some people in some cases. Okay, so what could Schmidt have been thinking about? It's a particularly weird argument because it doesn't appeal to an interesting fact about Newtonian mechanics, which we don't usually teach in Philosophy of Physics 101 necessarily, which is actually that the dynamics itself does have this interesting feature that it's actually symmetric under arbitrary time-dependent translations. There is a version of the equivalence principle that holds in Newtonian mechanics. So, and Newton knew this. Corollary VI, the Principia. If bodies moved in any manner amongst themselves are urged in the direction of parallel lines by equal accelerative forces, they'll all continue to move amongst themselves after the same manner as if they'd not been urged by those forces. So if I apply a force that accelerates every single thing in this room exactly the same way, no matter how arbitrary that acceleration is, you couldn't possibly know. If the same force applies to every particle in your body, not the same force, the same acceleration applies to every, it's a mass-dependent force, right? Applies to every particle in your body, you're not going to be able to tell that you're being accelerated.
And you're in free fall.
We haven't done free, so we're in Newtonian context at the moment. So free fall is an example of that in Newtonian mechanics.
If you apply all of them, I don't know.
I'm taking, so what I'm thinking in this context is that gravity is a force that does exactly this. Right. So free fall, that's
He's talking about the moons of Jupiter then, right?
Yeah, but they're not being accelerated exactly the same. It's linear, it's not rotational, it's not rotational acceleration.
No. Don't worry, sorry.
Okay.
Just keep going, keep going.
Good. And so then this sort of funny thing happened in this argument, and I'm going to go through a little bit quickly, so and then we don't need to worry too much about maths. But it's an example, it ends up being a nice example of the application of inertial frame functionalism in my view. So this is why this is here. So, and I should say, I mean, in the sense, it's not even my application, it's actually kind of David's. So this funny thing happens that Simon and I are writing these papers about Corollary VI roughly at the same time. And Simon says, look, we should have this kind of form of relationism due to Corollary VI. So we should try and embed that symmetry, and we're going to have very little space-time structure as a result. We're going to have to formulate Newtonian mechanics on something he calls Newton-Huygens space-time, what's called Maxwellian space-time. This is a space-time with a standard of rotation, but no explicit inertial structure. And its dynamics is entirely defined in terms of relative accelerations. And so you have a system of equations that don't get written down, that aren't writable down in our ordinary geometry. If you try and shoehorn this into differential geometry, you have to think of equivalence classes of models. And they transform under the Maxwell group, these equations. And this very strange thing happened because I sort of started from the same premises and reached an entirely different conclusion, which should worry you as a philosopher. So I wrote a paper at the same time that said exactly that symmetry, to be fair, thought about in the context of some other features of Newtonian mechanics and Newtonian gravitation in particular, should lead you to think that our standard way of presenting Newtonian theories, which I just did, has a kind of instability to it. You get to neo-Newtonian spacetime, it's an unstable stopping point. Consideration of the correct symmetry group takes you on a route that kind of David Malamud once took us on, but just without, in an austere way, without kind of driving any philosophical points home. It drives you towards thinking about a curved spacetime connection, which you define in terms of the flat connection and the gravitational potential. So my point was that Corollary VI actually ensures that a version of the equivalence principle, which I'll say a bit more about in a second, holds in Newtonian mechanics. This is what we just talked about with freely falling frames. You can't tell the difference in Newtonian mechanics between being continuously accelerated upwards at 9.8 meters per second squared and being in a gravitational field. That's one form of the equivalence principle, right? And so really we should drive home the same morals in Newtonian mechanics that we do in general relativity and decide that we have a curved space-time structure. We all knew that we could do Newton-Cartan theory. I was giving this talk to David Pathano, bless him, he thought I'd invented Newton-Cartan theory. And I really worried that he thought I was much smarter than I was, and that's why I have a job. Or other such things, but anyway, nobody's pretending, but my point was that it wasn't just that you can do Newton-Cartan theory, it's that you're forced into a curved space-time theory by correct consideration of the kind of structure of Newtonian mechanics and its symmetries. Okay, and so then David used to say to me and Simon, rightly, how did you both start with the same premises and reach different conclusions when neither of you seem to think the other person's done anything desperately wrong? Which is, and I would sort of scratch my head and say, well, it's something to do with the fact that I included gravity, I don't know. And so, actually, there's going to be a few points, and turns out this is sort of what happens when you ask me something and I scratch my head and I say, I don't know, and then my kind friends write a paper explaining why I think something, and which is very nice of them.
Simon's answer was no more satisfactory.
No, yeah, so I think the situation was, and I sort of think I was a little bit more right than him, but anyway, we'll see. So anyway, so various people were puzzled by this and wrote. So Jim Weatherall wrote some papers showing how you could map the structure of Newton-Cartan theory onto a version of Simon's theory put into differential geometric terms, and the sort of cottage industry of trying to understand this. But I think the clearest account comes from the paper of David's, which says, look, let's start from this account, vector relationism, this very austere account with almost no space-time structure. And then let's think about how on earth you would think about that theory as a universal theory or a theory of an actual, an extended theory. And that theory doesn't have any kind of background inertial structure, so it's very puzzling theory to try and do physics on. You've got this kind of minimal structure of Maxwellian spacetime. But now change the question and ask yourself what happens to the dynamics of a sufficiently isolated subsystem of the universe. So let's worry about the solar system or something. Well, for that system, it's going to turn out, because of gravitation, the rest of the universe is going to functionally define an inertial frame for that system. That's what it means that David chose in his paper. And the dynamics of that system relative to the center of mass of the rest of the universe transform not under the Maxwellian group, they transform under the Galilean group. If there were no universal forces, that notion of inertial frame would be the same for any two subsystems. But if you do have a universal force like gravity, then you're going to get a local notion of effective inertial frame being defined in this very minimal space, against this very minimal space-time background. And then he shows that the theory thus defined is effectively equivalent to Newton-Cartan theory. So test bodies will follow the geodesics of the Newton-Cartan connection, pick up the same inertial structure. And he concludes that there's essentially no difference between Newton-Cartan theory and Saunders' relational version of Newtonian dynamics. At the formal level, the latter can be reformulated as the former. At the substantive level, the inertial structure of Saunders' theory is well defined and coincides with that defined by the Newton-Cartan connection. So this is effectively a use. I mean, it's a formal argument, and you do a lot of work to prove the structure, but it's effectively a kind of use of inertial frame functionalism. So if you take that defining inertial structure is the key spatiotemporal role that's played by a space-time connection, and then you establish that this minimal theory that Simon wrote down has the resources within it to pick out a full inertial structure, it thus picks out an effective space-time connection, even if you didn't write that into the basic geometry of the theory. And so the functionalist conclusion is that the vector relations posits inertial and space-time structure in just the same sense that Newton-Carter theory does. Given that each can be formulated in terms of the other, you can think of them as two theories with basically the same space-time interpretation. So the small sense in which I was more right than Simon is that the Newton-Carter connection does pick out the space-time structure. And there's this much more minimal background sense of space-time structure, which isn't kind of complete for theorizing, where it's just the very, very minimal thing that you write down when you start the theory. But there's this richer notion of space-time structure that does get picked out, even when you try and write down your theory on a very minimal space-time structure. So Dasgupta is right in some sense that you get to kind of interesting worries about space-time structure by thinking about curved trajectories, accelerations, but you've got to do it with all of this dynamical consideration and thought about how actual systems behave in it. And if you think inertial notions are important and you think inertial structure is an interesting concept, you can get to these kinds of interesting conclusions. There's another feature that's heavily used by David in the paper, which I think is really interesting, because part of what he starts with is thinking about scale relativity of space-time structure. So he has this kind of recipe for thinking about inertial frames for subsystems of the universe, and you can use it for different subsystems at different scales. So you can think of the Earth-Moon system as surveying the inertial structure created by the sun's gravitational field, but you can simultaneously think of the entire solar system as having a particular inertial structure defined by the fact that it's all falling towards the black hole at the center of the Milky Way, right? And one of David's points here is that it makes good sense to practice in astrophysics. So we identify the complete Newton-Carter inertial structure in a global theory by applying exactly the same kinds of methods that you would if you just asked what's the effective space-time structure that, say, the Earth-Moon system feels. So some of this is sort of anathema to the way some people think about space-time structure, because again, I'm sort of saying there's not even one true, there's not just not one true space-time concept. There's not one true space-time structure either. It just all depends on what kinds of systems you're surveying. So and what, you know, if you're doing microstructure, it's going to look very different. Okay. That's all obviously correct, but there are some flies in the ointment. So I use the equivalence principle there. And that all had its root, as I pointed out, is this in this kind of Einstein equivalence. Now, everyone who's been to John's course and John is going to have their kind of stomachs turn at how I'm going to oversimplify debates around the equivalence principle right now. But I'd really lose a lot of my audience if I tried to do that as well on this. So, so the thought is this, you know, there's this basic, very, very appealing thought, right, that we just feel to, which is that, you know, you can't tell the difference between whether you're, you know, if I take the cathedral, I put it in empty space and I accelerate it upwards at 9.8 meters per second squared, and, you know, we have all our, you know, all the curtains drawn, you're not going to be able to tell the difference between the situation we're in now and that one. It's a kind of, it's another empirical symmetry that looks a bit like the Galilean shift symmetry. So that's Einstein's elevator, right? You're not going to be able to tell the difference between being in free fall in an elevator, or being in empty space in the absence of gravitational fields as well. And that seems like it makes some kind of connection between inertia and gravity. And isn't that good? And in the traditional story about general relativity, and by my lights, that's also the story that gets you to the thought that general relativity is describing space-time structure. It's meant to be a key crutch along the way to the thought that you're describing curved space-time geometry. Now, the details of how you work out the story, you know, it's sort of always interesting when you actually have to kind of do it in 5 minutes like a pop audience, right? You're trying to actually connect Einstein's elevator to the notion that you have a curved space-time geometry. It takes a bit of work, particularly because a lot of the curvature is space-time curvature, not spatial curvature. But you know, but you can sort of get there. But in contemporary and not so contemporary debates, that connection gets threatened by people getting very worried about the precise form of the strong equivalence principle, and also about the structure of general relativity itself. So there's one thing that goes back to Einstein, which I'm not going to talk about a great deal, which is the thought that there's no such thing as a privileged reference frame of general relativity. For Einstein, first generalization, that was kind of the point, right? He wanted there to be a theory with no privileged reference frames. So this notion that the key lesson of his theory is something about a set of privileged reference frames sounds wrong. And so this is the thought that the theory is somehow generally covariant, and that's an important feature of the theory. There's a big literature on that and whether there's any substantive sense of general covariance. Don't worry about that too much. But there's a second set of worries, which is that hand-wavy thing to say about Einstein's equivalence principle doesn't really work at a detailed level. Because, of course, if you had a sufficiently sensitive apparatus, you could tell the difference between being in this room and being in the cathedral going upwards at 9.8 meters per second in empty space. Because, in fact, trajectories in this room are falling towards the center of the Earth, right? And you're going to have what we call tidal forces. You don't have homogeneous gravitational fields in real life. So there's a whole set of worries about defining inertial structure in curved spacetime, where inertial frames are local. I'm going to say a little bit about those. So how are you meant to expand that kind of Einstein equivalence principle into something that can deal with the notion of tidal forces in local inertial structure and the fact that everything doesn't just accelerate downwards in parallel? And it wouldn't if curvature creates things that absolutely don't accelerate downwards in parallel. Right, so we need something like the strong equivalence principle. So here's Harvey Brown's formulation of it. I'm going to criticize it, so it's going to sound like I'm picking on Harvey Brown, but I've used this formulation in my own workloads, and most of the criticisms I'm going to talk about were aimed at me as much as Harvey Brown. But here's a formulation of it. There exists in a neighborhood of each event preferred coordinates called locally inertial at that event for each fundamental non-gravitational interaction. To the extent that tidal gravitational forces can be ignored, the laws governing the interaction by their simplest form in these coordinates. This is their special relativistic form independent of space-time location. That's the kind of way Harvey Brown puts the strong equivalence principle. So this is now trying to say, it's now trying to express the fact that if you had a sensitive enough measuring device, you could detect tidal forces in this room. But to the extent that you don't have anything that detects tidal forces, we can treat this room as inertial. Well, as accelerating upwards at 9.8 meters per second squared, actually. Slight detail. And there's a long history of objecting to the strong equivalence principle, worrying the equivalence principle doesn't really work, saying we should retire it like midwives, But here's an objection from Ohanian in 1977. This is sort of part of a class of objections that say, look, anything that's anytime you worry about getting to a small enough region that you're able to, so the notion of a local equivalence principle depends on the fact that for any notion of approximation required, given the kinds of tools you have around, there'll be some size of region that you can go to where you can ignore the tidal forces. And Ohanian tries to argue that's not the case, right? So think about like an idealized water droplet that's subject only to tidal forces, a kind of cloud of dust of some kind. Those forces will be of the same order as the dimension of the system. So they're not going to scale down as the system gets smaller. So there's no reference frame small enough that you can ignore gravitational forces. Inertial frames can only be defined at a point. Okay, and so here's a response to Ohanian that, again, I think David first proposed to me many, many years ago. So that would be a worry, right? If there were generalized forms of bodies that we really find out there in the world that always feel tidal forces at any scale, then it would be the case that the equivalence principle doesn't have any operationalized significance when those things are around. But of course, that's a particular kind of idealization. And the truth is that there's no such thing as a body that's only subject to tidal forces, right? There's only a cloud of dust that's got no restorative forces. We have real matter. Right? David's looking really worried. So I feel like I'm going to misrepresent what he said to me 20 years ago about the response to Ohanian. Any real system actually has restorative forces, and tidal forces will always scale down relative to other forces. So in any freely falling system, a scale can be found small enough that you can ignore gravity to any resultant approximation. What's the moral of this? Which is sort of going to be relevant to my morals in talking in how I end up thinking about these things, is that the actual physical details of the system you're modeling are absolutely crucial. These kind of general arguments about kind of, an idealization, you have to idealize all the time. But some general idealization, the question is that a realistic idealization proving the point you want to make for a particular kind of system? The physical details are always important. Okay. So that's a Hannian's objection, but there's still a group of people worrying about these things in the contemporary framework. And two of their worries are the following. The notion of the local used in the strong equivalence principle is hopelessly imprecise. So now this isn't an argument quite like in Hannian's, right? This is an argument that it's not that it's impossible to find such states, it's that you're not going to do it exactly enough, not giving a clear enough definition. So a phrase like to the extent that gravitational forces can be ignored introduces an unprecified notion of approximation. And there's a second objection, which is this notion of the simplest form of the dynamics not cashed out. I think I'm going to somewhat endorse 2 and question 1. But this comes down, and this is where I realize this niche. I actually kind of want to put Pittsburgh on my side in this, but I didn't want to put words in people's, especially because some books have moved to Pittsburgh. But and I should be very careful because I should explain that I'm very good friends with all the people. I mean, this is like very much an argument amongst friends. This is not like the people you all disagree with that we like to bash. Some other bits of these.
Who are those?
Like, you could probably work it out implicitly, like. But okay, we all think that certain overdone metaphysics is a bad idea, right? But there's this sort of thing that happens where I say something, and then particularly like Jim Weatherall says, I sort of get your point, I think I understand it, but you haven't proved a theorem to make all the notions you've used precise. And I go, well, that would be really hard, and I don't wanna, and I don't think I'd gain anything by doing it. And then actually, kindly, Jim then goes away and does it for me, which is fine. As long as I don't have to spend a year grappling with how to make everything precise. But there's a sort of methodological disagreement about what we get in particular scenarios here. So let me give you the following. So I think good philosophy of physics, right? The details of physical theory matter for interpretation. Better philosophy of physics, the details of application and modeling practice matter for interpretation. So let's go into more detail. Let's not try and necessarily look at theoretical contexts as a whole. Let's think about ways that things are applied in these different contexts. And then there's another moral and philosophy of physics, which I take to be in tension with that second one, which is that precision matters for interpretation. We should resolve ambiguities of precise mathematical definitions. Why do I take this last one to be in tension with 2? Because physicists don't go away and prove. Mathematical physicists sometimes do. Maths department does some things. But when you're actually modeling a system, proving a theorem to make your exact notion of approximation precise is not usually, it's a non-existence claim, but perhaps never what real applied physics ever does. So I think there's some tension between this desire for exact precision. It's particularly, the argument that I have with Jim is particularly about precision and approximation, which is not an oxymoron, but a little like one. So anyway, here are 2 guys who are very kind. I wrote a paper in 2013, and they have been trying to make it precise ever since. Which is really kind of them. So I was never going to do it. So Jim and Sam have just published a something that's a sort of long-standing project of theirs, trying to it's not just about my paper. It's trying to make this notion, the notions contained within the strong equivalence principle, precise. And I am grateful to them for doing so. And I think actually I'm going to be a bit kinder to them than I found in the last slide, because I actually think I did learn some things, some substantive things by their work. So let's recall this form of the strong equivalence principle. It had some things that it referred to. It referred to this notion of, to the extent that tidal gravitation is to be ignored, but it also discussed this notion of simplest form of a set of equations. And it talked about the special relativistic form of the theory. So what Jim and Sam tried to do is try and kind of extract what they think the kind of acceptable content out of the strong equivalence principle is. So some worries you might have. That, the notion of simplest form here is hard to pin down. And ways of pinning down how that gets implemented in general relativity, which usually appeal to something called minimal coupling, which is about how the matter fields couple to the metric. It turns out, in a way that I think we weren't particularly aware of 20 years ago, that that's a much more subtle notion than it looks like on the face of things. Maybe other people were aware of that 20 years ago, I wasn't. So they have worries about the kind of Harvey-Brown style formula equivalence principle for that kind of reason. But I think they have some appreciation. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So there's a whole group of people that would just say so much the worse for equivalence principles. They're just hopelessly woolly. But there is this substantive empirical symmetry that we've been discussing. Why can I model the dynamics of the solar system without worrying about Milky Way's central black hole? These are interesting facts about how we apply physics out there in the world. So what Fletcher and Weatherall end up doing in a sort of a pair of papers, one which I think rightly shows that some of them sort of purely geometrical, not worried about matter dynamics notions don't really work. They provide a kind of range of accounts that give content to the idea that the matter dynamics could be locally special relativistic in general relativity. And they do that so with extraordinary precision. So where do I agree with them? Where do I disagree with them? And where does it leave the kind of project I'm engaged in? So I think that one criticism I think hits home is that this simplest form notion, we kind of understand what it means when we see it. I'm not so worried about it being imprecise, but I am worried about being hopelessly syntactic. So it appeals to the form of a set of equations, which makes them very inflexible under rewriting in different forms. And it also appears to be a kind of theory-wide fact. It doesn't pay any attention to kind of individual models of the theory. So one of the things that they end up ultimately advocating is a kind of semantic approach to strong equivalence principles in the end. So they give conditions that particular models of matter dynamics, coupled with particular models of general relativity, might obey. I think that's actually a pretty good approach to filling out the strong equivalence principle. The other thing they do, though, is once they get to their semantic form, is they go, oh, this is very ambiguous. There's at least 3 or 4 ways to make this precise. And they go on and make it precise. So they show that there are 3 or 4 forms of ways of thinking about the form of the equations being locally special relativistic, if you like, or the equations being specially relativistic, so I want to get rid of the word form. And they point out that the implications don't always go one or both ways between these forms. So things can be locally special relativistic in one sense and not in another. So largely, I think this just kind of fills in a gap in the functionalist project. If you wanted to know exactly how it is that a particular matter system manages to instantiate the inertial frame, the inertial structure, you could appeal to one of these senses that the dynamics are locally special relativistic. It describes the exact conditions under which certain systems will obey the spirit of the strong equivalence principle. And thus define inertial structure, because I was very worried about inertial structure in general relativity, but once you've got this notion of locally specially relativistic, they think that there's an accompanying, well, at least Jim didn't object when I said he ought to think there's an accompanying unproblematic notion of inertial frame. So, should I be worried that they came up with mutually incompatible precipitations of a notion I think is important? I just think no. I think that's what we should expect. And this goes to the heart of what making something precise doesn't do. Making something precise in one particular way might fail to capture the way that the concept applies in various systems. If you do what Weatherall and Fletcher did and show that there's multiple forms of precipitation, then kind of, and you're happy with that pluralism, then I'm sort of happy with the ambiguous precision. But only because I think ambiguity is actually quite useful. So I think that the project they've entered into fills in the details for particular kinds of system as to how and when the metric plays a spatiotemporal role. It does it in different ways in different contexts. That's not the most extraordinary thing. It can fail to do so. It might do it in one sense and not do it in another. I don't think any of those things should be a challenge for suitably flexible thinking about notions like inertial frame and functionalism. And I don't think it's a challenge to the applicability of the strong equivalence principle in general. I should say they don't say it is. They just don't say. Which is very so they just say, oh, this is ambiguous. Well, here are 5 things you might mean. They're not all mutually compatible, but so they may be happy with this conclusion, but it's just a sense of knowing. So it sort of depends what you think the implicit dialectic is. Good. So what are the morals here? A good, thoughtful account of the content of general relativity will pay attention to the details of how particular matter systems pick out inertial structure. It can be fruitful to give the details of the ways in which that might happen, to give these precipitations. Not all precipitating is pointless. But the need for preciptation or an ambiguity of preciptation doesn't rob something like the strong principle of content. You don't need to pick a single form. You can think that this sort of gets fleshed out in different ways in different theories. I'm missing a missing my nicest picture. That's sad. I didn't realize I hadn't compiled. It's a nice big picture of the solar system here. And one way to see that this is going to have to be cashed out in different ways for different systems is to remember that we wanted to be scale relative about inertial space-time structure. The strong equivalence principle, this is a paper, a 2009 paper by David. The equivalence principle is supposed to hold for systems of interacting black holes and the solar system. That's part of what's useful about it. We genuinely use it in astrophysics in this kind of way, and so whatever version of the equivalence principle you have, it better apply to explain why the solar system can be modelled without worrying about the structure of the Milky Way. And you should expect, I think, in that circumstance, the details of a kind of a small scale matter field version of the equivalence principle and the details of how you fill it in a self-gravitating system to differ in important ways and use different notions of approximation. I think that's okay. Conclusions. Functionalist accounts can be flexible, context relative. They needn't be in the business of picking out one true and precise concept. Inertial frame functionalism isn't, I don't pretend that 200 years of physics evolution won't completely renovate OTOs, but right now it does a good job of picking out some structure that we're really interested in. And reports of the absence of inertial structure and general relativity have been greatly exaggerated. Okay, thank you very much.
If we need break, then we'll have the